here we are once again, another Tuesday, another live stream event. Great to have you all on board. Good to see so many on already, and a lot of questions whizzing around there already as well. I'm just going to put the pre-show on for a moment or two. I've got Chris on standby to join us very shortly. We'll just let this run for a moment or two and get the late comers in through the front door, as it were. There's some very good questions coming in there about October, and is it going to be a red October or not? A lot of interesting things. The stock markets, of course, were down again today, but that may have been a Facebook outage down rather than anything else, but we'll see tomorrow. Very interesting discussion, of course, because this time of year is the time of year that often markets do actually take a bit of a breather. And if you look back over in history, the corrections have actually been this time of year. So may be interesting to see. Just looking through the interesting comments there. I'm not going to put them up on the screen, but I will a bit later. And just a couple of acknowledgements there. Jason, good to see you. How are you doing? People talking about the fall in the market. Is it 30, 40? I think I said 30 to 40 is possible, certainly, over the next little while, but we'll see. Things are overvalued, of course, dramatically overvalued. And Cookie Boy says, over here, Martin, pick me, eat free. There you go. And I quite like that one from Fraser again. The CPI, the changing propaganda index. Yeah, well, it's certainly nothing to do with reality, is it? As we discussed. And yes, please, Michael, please do hit that like button. Very, very important. Thank you very much, Aaron. Glad you like the stuff. And Zach, nice to see you there as well. Okay, that's enough pre-chat. Let me get rid of that. I'm just going to run the intro and then we're back with the main show. See you in a second. Well, here we are. Good evening, welcome. And here we are on the 5th of October 2021. Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to have you on board. And we're going to have an interesting discussion about property and specifically mortgages tonight. Very important conversation for many people. Lots of people applying, lots of people perhaps thinking about refinancing. Lots of other questions, and I want to get into some detail tonight about some of the issues that people should be aware of when they engage with regard to mortgage applications, mortgage refinancing and those sorts of things, and we'll talk more broadly about property too. Just before I bring Chris in, let me just do what I normally do, which is just remind everybody that this isn't financial legal advice, it's just a general conversation. Please play nice in the chat room. We are moderating the chat. No racial slurs, please. As at the 5th of October 21, if you're watching in replay, use that Walk the World if you want to get my attention. That helps to make sure that you come out on my queue so that we can then look at your question. I've also enabled Super Chat, which means that you could potentially get your question to the top of the list using Super Chat, or more broadly, if you'd like to make a contribution to help us with the costs of making these shows, would be greatly appreciated. And with that introduction out the way, I'm going to get on with bringing Chris straight in. I think he's ready. He's just looking around. Are you ready, Chris? Yep. Okay.
I'm ready. Don't worry, Martin.
You're here. Hello. How you doing?
Life is good. How you doing?
Yeah, very good. And we should explain that there was a reason why we decided to have you on tonight rather than in a few weeks' time. You're likely to be a bit busier a few weeks down the track, right?
Yes. My heavily pregnant wife is 36 weeks or 35 weeks. I've started to lose count this week. So who knows, right, Martin? In a couple of weeks, in a month or so, I'll definitely know. So, hopefully a month rather than 2 weeks. But you can't time these things, can you, apparently?
Well, exactly right. So expect the unexpected. So it's great to have you on. And actually, it's very good timing because normally on the first Tuesday of the month, I do things like mortgage stress. I look at the Reserve Bank minutes and all those sorts of things. But the mortgage stress data came out pretty much the same as last month. In other words, it's all very bad and high. And the Reserve Bank basically just repeated what they said last month. So there's not much on. So actually, it would have been a very quick show tonight. So instead, and just to explain on mortgage stress, I might do a separate show about that later. But look, I wanted to talk to you about two things, Chris. And there was actually a question that somebody sent the other day, right? And their scenario is that they're a potential first-time buyer, right? And they are just trying to get their head around the mortgage application process, right? And they're basically trying to understand what's the right sequence of things to do, right? How do you go through the process of trying to understand what you might be able to borrow? Is that a good place to start? Or do you wait till you got a property? Then what's the application process like? And you know, difference between a mortgage broker and a bank, all of those sorts of things. So can we go through some of those basic things that you handle all the time with, you know, all of the clients that you have? And, you know, that perhaps will be a way into introducing yourself a bit more and also touching on some of those really important issues.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, right? Where do you start as a first-home buyer? And I mean, you probably shouldn't go and look at properties and start making offers before you start figuring out the finance. Makes common sense. But unfortunately, people do, right? We get clients coming to us. Even today, a client came to us and been knocked back at a bank, has already purchased and was going direct to the bank and has come to us saying, quick, save us. We've got settlement in 6 weeks' time. And so you definitely want to get in early. And I'd probably avoid going to the bank straight away because every bank's got different credit policy, right? Now, if you've got a super vanilla situation where you've got heaps of cash and you don't want to borrow that much money and you're working, well, yeah, maybe you can go into any bank and it's going to be fine if your credit's fine. But, you know, most people don't have that situation. There's something in their sort of profile that makes them lean maybe more towards one bank than another bank. The big mistake I think I've seen recently is a lot of banks get excited about a fixed rate deal or a really good introductory variable rate or an online lender, and then they'll lodge a pre-approval with them, maybe get declined or maybe even if it gets approved, but that deal changes, right, over the period between when they lodge that pre-approval, when they purchase in the future. And I've seen clients actually shop banks, you know, go multiple banks 3 or 4 times, and it really affects their credit score. So first thing is probably go speak to a decent mortgage broker. Obviously, I'm very biased, but, you know, there are a bunch of brokers out there, 16,000. I'd probably try to go to someone with a bit of experience. It does take some time to really grasp bank policy and how to get loans approved. Like, you do need to be lodging quite a lot of applications and see a variety of cases to know how to lodge an application and get a high chance of success rate. A good broker will be able to go through your situation and say, right, you know, have you got a visa? Are you an Australian citizen? Yeah, that's all fine. You know, are you working? What's your situation with work? Are you part-time? Are you full-time? Are you casual? You know, those will have different times you need to be working there. You know, if you're a contractor, have you been contracting before? They'll ask you the questions like a bank credit assessor would. You know, are you self-employed? When did you get your ABN? So they can already point out the things that may be an issue in the bank size, really. Then you've got, obviously, your assets, your savings. And a broker can really educate you on, you know, how much deposit do you really need? You know, there's a lot of misunderstanding that you need a 20% deposit and you've got to save up for that before you can purchase. A lot of people misunderstand the cost of LMI and they just try to avoid it. Or, you know, we had a client recently trying to buy with a 6% deposit plus stamp duty and was paying this enormous LMI, and we were educating her that, look, if you just save this extra little amount, then you'll reduce your LMI. So a good broker will educate you on a deposit, any issues you potentially have with your income. We do credit checks on every client. We spend over $1,600 or 20 grand a year at Equifax, you know, doing credit checks and title searches and all things on our clients like a bank would. We just never want to lodge a loan and find out about something. We'd rather find out straight away and deal with that and talk about that issue, get it solved. Like just last few weeks ago, we got a discharge removed off a client before we lodged it at the bank. She wasn't even aware of it. So sorting out your credit, figuring out if there's any issues with your income, figuring out your deposit, and then sort of educating on borrowing capacity really, and what you can based on your current income. But a lot of what we do is also talk, well, how's that going to change over the next 6 or 12 months? Like, yes, you can borrow X today, but is that dramatically going to be more in the future? And should you potentially wait? And a lot of people should, because, it's, buying something isn't just the number one priority always. It's about getting a quality asset and something you can grow into, and waiting, whether it's for saving or higher income, is a good decision. So a good broker can talk you through that. They can talk you through how to protect yourself with loan structuring, and offset accounts and fixed rates versus variable rates, how all the different pricing works, etc. So, getting into a good broker early on, understanding those if there's any issues, getting an understanding about your borrowing capacity. You still haven't lodged a deal with a bank yet, right? The bank's the final bit. And then finally, when you're maybe out there thinking about taking action, that's when I would lodge a pre-approval. I'd be really tentative lodging multiple pre-approvals. You really just want to have one quality one. And then when you purchase, you just go back to market because you become top queue at a bank. And so you go, right, I've lodged a pre-approval with St. George or Macquarie. ING are offering an amazing rate. We've got 6 weeks up our sleeve there, only a couple of days turnaround time. Let's just go to ING. So you don't need 6 pre-approvals at every potential bank that could be an option. So hopefully that's a long answer, Martin, but hopefully that's...
Well, no, the thing about that, Chris, is that...
tips there for those buyers.
Sorry, you're just phasing in and out a bit. Hopefully you'll be fine. Yeah, very interesting. And of course, there's a lot of stuff that you've actually touched on there. Maybe we could just unpack a couple of those things. But the pre-approval thing, right? The pre-approval thing is really important, because a lot of people assume that that's the first thing they should do. But it isn't quite sequentially a good place to start, is it?
Well, I mean, you should definitely get a pre-approval before you start making offers, because, there may be things that you just don't know about that are going to stop you getting finance. It's probably a credit issue, to be honest. But, it's probably having that live conversation. We as brokers really sort of talk through clients and go, okay, well, are you single? You're in a couple? Are you going to have kids? Where's your family? Where are you going to live long term? All those sort of questions. What are you going to do with your other assets? What's it going to do with changing jobs? So I think there's a life plan first is the first thing. And then thinking through, okay, actually, what are we trying to achieve here? Are we trying to grow some money so we can upgrade in a few years' time and buy something else? Are we trying to, make money fast, which is not a great idea, but, trying to get your strategy right first and think it through on a deeper level. Also try to think about what's motivating you. One of my biggest bugbears is the pressure of society, media, family, friends, colleagues, everywhere you look, right? Putting that pressure on you, you're not successful unless you've got a property, all that nonsense, right? And then when clients come to us, they're extremely stressed and they just want to buy the first thing, to get rid of that pressure off them and to get that monkey off the back. And we spend a lot of time really trying to calm them down and actually educate them and go, actually, you know what? The advice you're getting isn't the best advice. They're just trying to force you so they can feel more successful because you're more successful in their eyes. So, big bugbear.
Yeah, motivation. Now, Cookie Boy asked a question, which I think is quite a good one, which actually followed up from one of the other questions I had before the show. Are banks more thorough on paperwork? I know for a fact people years ago were making up fake pay slips to get approved. There's a bit more rigor now in the process, isn't there?
Oh, look, if are people doing fraud on mortgages? Probably out there. I mean, it'd probably be a bit of a challenge for the mortgage broker to want to have been in business for long if you are doing that right. But are banks getting savvier with that? Absolutely. Banks can see a cross-checking. Are those debits from the your pay going into your bank account? Income's definitely getting verified. I mean, they're potential. Some banks actually call where you're working. They'll check on your LinkedIn profile. A lot of the time they'll look at your story. This is happening a lot with regional customers. Actually, people trying to escape the city and they're going, okay, you work here, but you want to move here, and you're telling me you want to buy a home. We need clarity on how you're actually going to get this, or can you get us a work letter to say that they're happy to keep you employed? And so, are people dodging loans? Probably out there, absolutely. Is it the income side? I doubt it. I think it's probably more the other things that they're sort of, inflating or deflating.
Yeah, the expenses cost, so that's always the wobbly side, isn't it? Particularly after the Westpac case got thrown out, and basically it's a bit more free than it was previously. But the other factor, of course, in all of this, Chris, is the hurdle rate. In other words, the rate at which a bank is actually making an assessment, because of course CBA announced the other day that actually lifted their floor rate, which also just puts a bit more pressure on people.
Yeah, I mean, you got to, that did drop dramatically, right? So it was in the 7s and they dropped it to 5, and then it went, I was like, wow, that's a big increase in borrowing capacity. And then bang, it went under 5. And I think a lot of the banks are like starting to lift it a little bit, and CBA sort of try to lead the fight, I guess. But I actually think there's a bit of a bigger picture at play, Martin. You love these conversations. I think they knew the writing was on the wall, right? That, APRA are going to want to do something. And, they're trying to say, well, why don't we just lift the assessment rate a bit? See how that goes first before we come in with these DTI limits and these big changes to borrowing capacity. Why don't we just lift the assessment rate a little bit? And I think they were trying to, prod APRA in that direction rather than DTI limits.
Yeah, I think that's a smart analysis. I think they were absolutely being preemptive, hoping that that would deflect APRA from the focus, right? Because, of course, if you look over the pond, they've done quite a lot over there in New Zealand with regard to debt-to-income ratios, and they're talking about other things. But, I mean, let's talk about the DTI limit just for a little while, right? Because, basically APRA has said over the next couple of months they're going to do a bit of thinking about it, right? And they might do a bit of consulting, etc., etc. So there's no indication precisely what they're thinking of doing, if they're thinking of doing anything, or whether they're just talking about it. Maybe they're hoping that just talking about it will put enough pressure on the banks so that effectively you don't need to do anything at all. But what's your read then in terms of is the DTI thing a serious issue? I mean, it does seem to me that there are more loans being written at higher debt-to-income ratio than previously, and that's partly driven by new loans. But also I've noticed in my surveys a lot of people's income has dropped because of the COVID, because the job momentum has actually eased. So, it's not actually necessarily the amount of the loan that's changed, although some people might be refinancing and pulling equity out. It's actually the fact their overall income's come down, and that's where a lot of the pressure is. So in a way, fixing debt-to-income ratios for new loans won't really solve the real structural problem that we've got.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the stats are all out there, right? So 1 in 5 buyers are over sort of 6 times, right? So that means still 4 in 5 are borrowing under 6 times, right? And so is that 1 in 5 spread evenly across the country? No, there'll be some pockets where there's 0 in 5 and some pockets where there's 2 or 3 in 5 are borrowing more than 6 times. And so absolutely this will hit the home buyer capital city markets, right? The people who are taking on a lot of debt to get something in a house in the capital cities. I mean, does it really stop them buying? No. I mean, if for example, they've got a lifestyle or a family need because they need a bigger place and they're concerned about that long-term security, they potentially will just exhaust all other avenues, right? To figure out, is there any other ways they can bridge that gap, sell other assets? I also think that the numbers are a little bit skewed. I mean, it's good practice, right? If you, for example, are buying, $1 million property, is to borrow at 80% of the property value, because there's not a financial incentive. Some banks are doing it now. If you borrow at a lower LVR, you'll get a better rate. But traditionally, there's not. You don't pay any mortgage insurance costs. And so you could buy $1 million property with an $800,000 loan, which may be more than 6 times your salary, and you could be putting $300,000 into an offset account, and or you could have a $200,000 share portfolio, and that is not factored in. So yes, you look like you're a high risk lender, but you've actually got a lot of money in your offset account. And so I think that's kind of playing to the figures. I think that the cascade effect will happen. I don't think it'll change, like stop demand. It'll just make people spend a little bit less money, right? It'll stop upgraders looking to sell, because it's already hard for upgraders to upgrade at the moment, because if you're looking to upgrade, you're looking for usually a better and bigger place than what you had before. And those are the properties that have generally gone up more than the smaller properties that like the starter properties. And so that upgrade gap's got bigger. And then you add in stamp duty selling costs. And so a lot of people wanting to do that do have to borrow at a very high level of DTI. And so they will potentially say, well, we can't do the upgrade now. And we've already seen this literally happen today. The client just said, well, look, we're just going to renovate. we're going to be a modest renovation, and because we haven't got the greatest of assets, it's like a good suburb but a really poor street and not a great property itself. We're just going to go and buy an investment property, and so it hasn't stopped them doing the upgrade, but it's just shifted into an investment property. So I think the DTI thing will slow definitely. It may be about 10-15%. So if someone's trying to buy at say 2, maybe they now have to look at 1.7, but they just shift that demand into other sort of areas. I do think there'll be a bit of FOMO as soon as it's sort of a bit clear on when it's going to happen and what's going to happen. Absolutely, if you're in that position where if you use it or lose it, you think you'll find that you'll see some crazy bidding. And we have seen, fortunately, people being a bit more picky in this second half of the year than we saw in the first half. The first half, we saw some huge prices, way over the odds, and for not the greatest of properties. We have seen that really tailor off. We've seen much fewer purchases and less poorer quality properties, the desperation sort of going off. So hopefully that sort of helps answer the DTI question.
Yeah, and just on the DTI thing, I've got this little theory, which is that actually the reverse psychology is also happening, right? So if people are worried that down the track things are going to get tighter, that might pull forward demand, and people actually will go and just get it while they can, right? Because they looked across the ditch and suddenly it's a lot harder over there than it was. Now, there could actually be an argument for saying, well, is that actually reverse psychology that Josh Frydenberg is using? Because he's basically saying, well, maybe that's something we should talk about, right? And that's a way of trying to pull more demand forward. I don't know, but just a thought.
Yeah, I mean, investors do that, right? So, we absolutely have seen investors back. I haven't really said that, but when we look at who's purchasing and what they're purchasing, and they are going a lot to the regions. A lot of investors have always gone to the regions just because of affordability. It's much cheaper to buy than a big lumpy asset in the capital city. Not to say that I think that's been a great strategy for those investors. The same as buying high-rise units and new property. A lot of investors do that for the tax benefits, but we all know that hasn't been a great strategy and won't be a great strategy. But I do think people are going to the regions a little bit smarter. We're definitely seeing that. They're trying to buy the top end of lots of different markets. The properties people are going to leave the capital city for. And I do think the regions are going to decouple a little bit. The top end, the things that are really attractive to families leaving the capital cities, I think they've got very strong growth because from affordability metric compared to a capital city, they get a lot more for their money. And so if they can, in their mind, justify the move with the commute and all that sort of thing, I do think that part of the market's really strong, and we are seeing a lot of investors sort of going for those type of properties. Yeah,
it's interesting because I'm in my survey seeing a pickup in momentum from some investors who are really quite interested in trying to get in, particularly houses, and particularly, as you say, away from those high-rise. But I'm also seeing other investors who are really stuck with very poor quality assets, particularly in the high rise. And I keep pointing to North Ryde because North Ryde is that sort of, it's a bit like Mandurah in the Western Australian thing for mortgage stress. North Ryde is my example of high rise stupidity, right? And I see more and more people who basically bought high rise investment apartments and the prices are down 26% now from where they were in 2017. There's been no bounce at all in recent times. And they are just trying to get out. So there's a really interesting rotation amongst different types of investors and different types of property investment, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got, I always it's easy for me just to think about recent client conversations, but absolutely we've got a client who's got a couple of places in south, east and west, I think, of Brisbane, around that sort of affordability market, that 300-400 market. And has done quite well, really. When you look at the actual capital gain, I could try to convince him not to buy both of these properties, and he's a good mate. And he's just realised it's finally hit home that the challenges with this market long term. A lot of your debt stress you're talking about, Martin, raising rates, etc. So he's decided to cash in, right? And you are even another client today, just got an apartment in Melbourne and going, wow, I can't believe we're going to sell it for this, based on a couple other sales in the area. There's so much, let's just get out, right? And so investors who have had poor results from properties or are concerned about them, absolutely, when they potentially get any opportunity to sell, they sell. And there's usually a lot of other investors in these markets because they're being spooked too by some type of quantity strategy, and there's so many different organizations that do this, and they all put them all in these same areas, and then they create some article around why that outer ring suburb is going to boom, and then all these investors sort of leave, so you create all this supply, right? And there's not enough demand to sort of and a lot of those gains quickly get evaporated if you don't sell. So I do agree, Martin. There's new investors coming in, but I do think there's a lot of people pulling out if they can get any sniff of a better price.
Yeah, and I'd also say a bit of that is also happening out on the urban fringe. I was talking to somebody the other day who's was expecting to get around 900,000 for his property, but the best they could get was 700,000, right, which was way below what they expected. And then they started to look around and realize that there are other people also trying to sell and also having the same issue, right? So again, you got to go granular. You got to actually look at the types of property and where they are and what's going on. And I think people are very much misled by these sort of high-level metrics that say, property was booming this year, right? Property is not booming everywhere. It is not. Absolutely, it's not, right? There are some areas where they've gone through the roof, but there are others where they've not gone through the roof. So you have to get granular. You have to look at the local data, and that's the only way to really be able to understand what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, Mark, I talk to a very a smaller subset than the whole market, right? For the last 8-9 years, all our clients have been young couples and families. Usually double incomes, and usually one of those parties is, sometimes both, are earning, way above average incomes, right? And and so that's the market that we talk to. Is so where are they going? What are the decisions that they're making? And and that's not what the whole market's doing, but it does show. How some parts of the market will perform differently because it's what that subset wants. And there's a real scarcity of properties that they want. They can't afford the houses in these areas. They still want lifestyle. They still want to raise a family in this community and live in certain pockets. And there's a real lack of properties that come on the market and lack of properties that turn over every year because people don't want to leave these suburbs, and they're tightly held. And so it's that's what we understand is where are they going? What are the behaviours and changes that are they making?
Yes, and again, you have to look granular. I mean, down here, so south of Sydney towards Wollongong, there are a couple of suburbs north of Wollongong that have gone gangbusters. I mean, 25-30% up, right? Austinmere and a few others. Two factors there. One is a lot of money come out of Sydney, right?
Yep.
And people are buying larger places, particularly standalone properties with quite a lot of land, often with quite good views that they could never get close into Sydney. But that's having an interesting knock-on effect because it means a lot of locals now are priced out of buying in this area. And so they're having to look further south, and quite often south of Wollongong, down towards Shell Harbour and down there. So there's a big sort of local drift going on at the moment. And these dynamics are really having huge impact on the value of the property, but also it changes the nature of the particular suburbs that you're looking at as well. There's some amazing dynamics going on.
Absolutely. So what's happening last year, your area, Martin, went from, and the thing that was holding us back was commute.
Yep.
I don't want to live down there because of the commute. That shifted with COVID, right? And so everyone went there. Everyone went to Avoca in, Central Coast. This year, those places have gone up way too much, right? And now families are saying, well, where else can I go? And they're actually trying to explore. And so they're actually going further down the train line now, Martin. They're going down Mangaton and Figtree and Corrimal and all these other, just to the north of Wollongong, because they can't afford Bulli. They can't, and the same in the Central Coast. We, having clients doing all over different pockets of the Central Coast now, but, where there's offer great lifestyle, nature, ocean, the schools, and still getting, out of the Central Coast if they have to with the train, etc. And so, that's what happens as prices change. Also, suburbs change. And, if a suburb gets more expensive, what's going to make it continue to get more expensive? It has to hit a new subset. It has to be like, okay, maybe first home buyers wanted to be there, but for it to go the next level, upgraders are going to want to have to move in, who have usually got more money and higher incomes. And so if it really stays a first home buyer affordable market, if people don't ever want to upgrade into it, then that constricts its growth long term. And so you definitely want a market to appeal to, a broad market of buyers rather than just say the affordability sector or investors or, singles and, young couples rather than, the families and different levels.
And the other thing that's happened as a result of those movements is now people are subdividing much more down here, right? So basically, you're suddenly finding that those 600 squares are now sort of 2 times 300, right? And the planning allows that, which suddenly means then that the character of the place is changed and the density is changed. And I mean, it's really fascinating just watching, even in a relatively quiet, I was going to say relatively rural, but yeah, so it's all relative. We have our own traffic jams between 8:55 and 9:10 on a normal day. But the point is that it does change it, and it changes the dynamics. And the more I look around other suburbs in and around Sydney and indeed Melbourne and elsewhere, I see these changing dynamics all the time, with different suburbs morphing into rather different types of locations. It really is quite fascinating.
Yeah, so there's certain pockets of every suburb that are more likely to be divided. There's more likely to be high density, for example, around train stations, around busy roads, flatter blocks, etc. And, when you are purchasing in a market, you definitely want to really think through how would that suburb shift over time, because the last thing you want to do is look over your back fence or your side fence and see 4 townhouses being built, and you want to entertain out the back, for example, or you could have your privacy could completely go with a high rise, etc. And so, absolutely, suburbs are going to get more dense, but there'll be certain pockets of suburbs that just won't change. Maybe there's heritage overlays, maybe it's real rules around the streetscape, etc. And as suburbs cut up blocks of land, then the other pieces of land that haven't been cut up become more desirable. And because they become more scarce. And so you've got to be careful of these things when you're entering a market, trying to understand how a suburb will shift.
Absolutely, yeah, it's very important. And, when I bought the place that I'm currently in now with the studio and everything here, one of the things that attracted me was it couldn't be built out at the front because it was up a hill. And, there was land below, but it's way down below. And so you're never going to lose the view. Now, interestingly, I've been speaking to a couple of people in the last couple of weeks who bought and then discovered that the view that they had disappeared. Right? Got nothing about it. It's just over the road. They decided to build up an extra couple of floors and it's all gone.
Yeah, no, it definitely happens, Martin. I mean, I think it's common sense to think it through, but common sense isn't common, I like to say.
Common sense is a bit rare. Now, here's one from Aaron from earlier on. In light of the Pandora Papers, will Australian government enact potential foreign property ownership restrictions? Slight chuckle at that. No, they won't. We have seen no evidence at all of the Australian government wanting to deal with money laundering through property or dodgy property transactions or anything. I don't think this is going to be any different. I don't know what you think, Chris.
I mean, it's bringing money in from overseas into our economy. If it comes in via property, I'm pretty sure the government turned a blind eye. So, yeah, I mean, they did try. It was a really interesting thing. They did try to, target expats and foreign investors, and they did make it much harder for them to borrow. And a lot of those rules are still standing. It's still much harder if you're living around the world. And they made some major changes to tax, CGT, the owner-occupier exemptions, and claiming negative gearing. Well, there's lots of tax changes they have made that don't make it as attractive residential property when you're overseas. And so I do think they've done something. There's foreign stamp duty costs if you're not an Aussie to buy property, etc. So I think they are doing things to slow down foreign sort of investment in Australia compared to what it was in the the early 2010s, I guess.
Yes, but they haven't done anything on the money laundering, and there were recommendations. Was it 5-6 years ago that they should implement some extra controls and bring real estate agents and lawyers into the loop, so that there was less chance of effectively money laundering flowing through the property sector. But that's been weirdly rejected.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much money in it, right? So yeah, we know what and that's the thing, is understanding the system the Australian economy is on. You might not agree with it, and I don't agree with it in a lot of senses. It's not really a productive asset, right? To be going in a lot of buying a property, going in a lot of home debt, then getting tied to a job to pay off your mortgage, You're less likely to take financial risk. You're less likely to start a business. You're more likely to just want to get the money so you can pay for your mortgage. So I don't think that's a great trait for a society. And there are lots of other things, problems with, marginalising society, homelessness, all these other things that pop out. But that's the system, right? It's now $9 trillion, and that's the system we've built. And so it's just understanding that, and rather than saying it's right or wrong, it's sort of just being aware of it.
Absolutely. Now, one of the things I wanted to touch on was the question of interest rates, right? We know that interest rates have been very low. The Reserve Bank cut rates. We've got the term funding facility, which is cheap money for 3 years, which means the banks can chuck cheap loans out. What are you saying to your clients and potential clients in terms of how they should be planning for the next few years with regard to rates? Are you expecting rates to go up, stay the same, go down? I mean, how are you facing that particular issue?
I mean, most people are looking at their mortgage repayment even today and going, that's very affordable, to be honest. Yes, there are people who are taking on those loans at 6 or 7 times, but what they're doing is they're backing themselves because they're investing in themselves and their career, and they're saying, look, I do think I'm going to earn more money in the future, and I'm working towards this bigger pay, and that's going to really reduce a multiple of their sort of income in terms of their debt. So, are people concerned about rising rates? Absolutely, right? I mean, it's common that everyone knows the rates aren't going to stay like this for 30 years. How much do you plan for? Well, we're not planning for much in the next, say, 3 or 4 years. You can get a 3-year fixed rate at under 2%, and if you're worried about rates rising, then fix it for 3 years at 1.89% or something, right? So I do think there's a lot of misunderstanding about how much repayments jump if interest rates go up, because you're already paying a lot of capital, and you can see that through 90% of loans now are going principal and interest, right? There's not an interest only problem. So most borrowers have either finished their interest only term and are now paying principal and interest. So they've already had a jump up in their repayments because they're now paying capital. And most borrowers are already today going principal and interest. And who's to say they can't get interest only easy in the future? We just don't know, right? So a lot of, even if rates rise, maybe we could see interest only loans increase, right? But even if rates do rise, there's a complete misunderstanding of how much the repayment rises, especially if you can refinance your loan and reset your loan term at 30 years, which a lot of borrowers in their 30s, 40s, as long as they're still working, they can just go to another bank, reset their loan term for 30 years. And even if the rates go up, it doesn't increase their repayments that much. So even if a rate goes 5 to 3.5%, that's a 1% rate rise. On $1 million mortgage, that increases repayments from $4,000 a month to $4,500. So a 1% increase in rates is only $500 a month. You might think, well, that's a lot of money, etc. But the person going into that debt's backing themselves. They're probably thinking $4,000 a month really affordable to themselves. And so they're not that concerned if rates rise by 1%. It's just the number itself does become very deflationary. And so the way to slow the market down absolutely will be starting to lift rates. And that will be the way that slows down. Even just if it's a 15 basis points or, up to 0.75 or something, just that fear will slow down spending. And that will potentially mean that it won't keep lifting rates. But, that's the way to slow the market down. I don't think this DTI thing is going to really just kill demand. It's not going to be like a lot of people think the Royal Commission and the credit crunch of 2018, 2019 was APRA-induced. No, that was the Westpac case that caused that issue. It was the Royal Commission, the worry about the banks getting sued, them freaking out about their credit policy, cutting lending, and making it really hard to get a loan. That is not what's happening now if there's like DTI limits. It's a completely different reality.
Yes, I mean, that's more at the margin. The interest rate stuff will hit, but, as you say, people often have fixed rates for a period of time. Of course, next time, in 3 years' time, they may have to pay a bit more. But the real question here, Chris, is actually what's going to happen to incomes, right? Because over the last few years, of course, real incomes have not grown at all. If, in fact, incomes start to move up a bit, then that allows people to be able to handle this no problem. If, in fact, incomes stay flat or continues to degrade, as some sectors are, that's going to be another further pressure.
Yeah, absolutely. There'll be people who have no buffers, are struggling to pay their mortgage repayment, and if there's any increase in their mortgage repayment, and they've got no other buffers, they've got no savings, they're going to lean on family, they'll have to sell. Absolutely. So you'll see arrears rates increase, but it's in the bank's incentive, and this happened with the last couple of years. It's really taught that to us all, but the bank's interests are trying to keep the borrowers in their home. So the banks want to keep the borrower in the home, and the borrower will do everything they can not to sell that property because they don't want to crystallize that loss.
Yep.
They know they'll never get back into the market, and they'll do absolutely everything they can. They'll stop putting food on their table, to be honest, Martin. And so the reality is, I think you'll find that are increase. When you say wages aren't rising, we all know it's a capitalist society, right? And a certain portions, you're seeing massive increases in wages. You're seeing new incomes move to our country in terms of migration. And so, yes, there's no broad wage growth, but a subset are definitely getting wage rises. It's just not broad across the whole market.
No, I agree, absolutely. And, I've spoken about this before. You've got this K-shaped recovery thing, right? So you've got a proportion that are doing reasonably well, and in fact doing very well in some cases. And if you're in the right industry, income's very strong. But there are others that are not. And unfortunately, a lot of those people who are not seeing the wages growth are the people with the big mortgages and the large debt pools and the risks because they perhaps overcommitted themselves earlier on as well. So that's why it's important to understand where you are and what your financial footprint is, and then think about what may happen so that you can begin to plan for some of those things that may be ahead.
So, it depends on what you think is a big debt pool, right? So if you think it's a big debt pool because as a percentage of the value of the property, absolutely they are. The things that I'm still concerned about absolutely is the house and land packages. When you're paying an inflated price with developers, you can always build more supply. You've got usually a highly targeted to first home buyers with very highly leveraged properties, borrowing at 95%. That's what the Scott Morrison sort of thing is encouraging as well, right? And home builder and stamp duty concessions, etc. Absolutely, they have a big mortgage and they've got no buffers. And if there's any drop in the LVR in terms of the capital value, then absolutely you're going to see problems there. The other end of the spectrum are the people who've got big mortgages. They're split into two. The people who've got big expensive homes, let's call it, or a home, and then lots of investment properties. The ones with the big expensive homes, if you look at house prices, Martin, yes, they could potentially have problems paying for the mortgage. They've probably got other assets to leverage on that they can pull up. They've got family, they've got other things. They'll try to extend their loan out. Absolute worst case, you'll see an increase in supply of people selling out of these areas. But there's always people who are desperate to get into that area, right? Who want to move from an area to get closer into that area. So even if you see an increase in supply, you'll see more demand, people wanting to upgrade into that area. The people with big investment portfolios, absolutely. A lot of those have been in a lot of pain for a lot of years. They leveraged up on interest-only loans, way over what they could afford to borrow. And they've been selling down poor assets and trying to keep hold of their good ones. And so that problem just has to work through the system because they over-leveraged in 2015 and they're still dealing with the pain because they just bought poor assets. And so that'll keep playing out.
Yeah, and that is a point. The decisions you take in a particular point in time echo down, and they echo down through many years. Unfortunately, if you make good decisions, great. If you make less good decisions, then you have to reap the whirlwind for a long period of time. And what I find quite often in my surveys is that people made a bad decision. They sort of struggle for a few years. Don't really want to come to terms with the decision that they took, but ultimately they get forced to do something a bit more serious, and sometimes the answer would have been, well, you should have done that sooner, because in fact just by trying to keep this balloon in the air a bit longer, what you've done is you created a bigger problem for yourself.
Absolutely. Loss aversion, no one wants to lose money, right? It's even if that's why you don't hear about it much in property, right? We know what happens. People don't talk about it at barbecues when they potentially, they never factor in the stamp duty and the selling costs and the maintenance and the the repairs and blah, 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 right? And the opportunity cost of what they did nothing and just paid off the mortgage with that negative gearing loss. And so absolutely, people do everything they can to, and that's, whereas in shares, right, a lot of people would do, oh God, I'm losing some money, all right, let's just get out. Even though behavioural bias, a lot of people still the same thing plays out. But in property, people just have that mentality that it's going to be okay and just got to ride it out and all property goes up. And unfortunately, that keeps a lot of poor assets going for a lot longer than they should be, because everyone just doesn't sell. Everyone's like, oh, it'll come back, and obviously it never does, because as soon as it comes back to a price that people are happy to take, knowing that everyone's usually entered at a certain price point, especially in these new developments, etc., people run because they all want to get just their money back. So if they bought for 300, as soon as things get back to 300, everyone wants to sell. That creates more supply, and then that forces prices back down. So usually the best thing to do is absolutely, a poor asset's a poor asset. Sometimes taking that loss and then trying to make that money back through other means is better than just holding on debt, stressing about it, and hoping a poor asset becomes a good one.
And you make a really interesting point about the difference of attitudinal behaviour between selling on buying stocks and property, right? Because when the stock market over a year ago went down by 20, 30%, a lot of people bailed out, right, on the way down. Of course, then the market recovered dramatically, so they actually basically, unless they bought back in, missed out. Whereas the reverse is true on property. People just don't want to they don't want to take a loss at all. They believe that property prices always go higher. You'll always go. You should always make on property. And then, as I've said before, Chris, and I'll say it again, when you actually do the math and you take all the costs of transacting, maintaining, and ultimately selling the property, a lot of people would be horribly surprised by the lack of growth and the lack of wealth they've been created through the process.
Yeah, I mean, I've been trying to warn first home buyers for years, right, around the different types of property they should be avoiding. I mean, even just an email through a couple of hours ago, she's a first home buyer, she's buying by herself, and there's a lot of, it's in Melbourne, for example, and there's not much on the market, and she thinks this is a good opportunity, and it's a poor asset, and it's not a good opportunity, but, trying to stop her doing that, etc. Because a lot of first-home buyers, unfortunately, they're feeling the biggest pressure from family. They haven't had the experience before. Even the people with experience doesn't mean that they know what they're doing, but, a lot of their mistakes are really costly, right? You talk a lot of the people who bought in, high-rise apartments in 2015, 2016, right? You're talking, 5-6 years later? The apartments are worth probably less, a lot of them, than what they paid. Then you got stamp duty, you got selling costs. They could have just easily rented those apartments. It's not hard to rent the apartments that they bought. Every other property around them's for rent. If you get kicked out, there's always another high rise up the road that's probably newer than what your 5-6 year old high rise is now. And so, absolutely, you've got to factor all those things in. It's not just about just getting a property.
No, absolutely right, and a lot to think about there. And quite often, of course, people just get bounced into it. They sort of basically assume that it's bound to be a good thing. It doesn't have to be. It could be a bad thing. You've got to actually do the work, which is what this conversation and what all our conversations are about, right? I'm not anti-property at all, right? I want people to make good decisions. That's the critical thing. Make good decisions rather than just bad decisions, right? Or don't just get swept along because everybody else is doing it. Make sure you've got a basis for the decisions you take.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Demand's just going to keep increasing long term. If assuming that our population keeps on rising, and the kids that are being born today are still living here in 30 years' time, and they're wanting to have a family or want somewhere to live and a shelter. So, yeah, I mean, you can't be anti-property because you're saying that people will never want to own the shelter that they live in, right? And then we're not going to, over time, have more people wanting to own shelters. So, yeah, you can't really sit on that camp. It just doesn't make sense.
No. I'm not sitting on that camp. I want people to make good decisions. Now, here's a really interesting question from Harmit. Question for you, Chris. How much should a family borrow if they are first home buyers? 5 times income, 6 times income? Please do reply.
Harmit, look, I think people look for the holy grail with finance, right? And they look to follow certain beliefs of people and say, right, you should only spend 30% of your income on a mortgage repayment, 50% on other costs, and 20% you save, right? Everyone tries to follow, like the barefoot investor, for example. I know Scott well, but, putting your money in certain buckets, and they're looking for this sort of real guide, and you should just do that. That way, it really depends on your situation. Like if you're at 5 or 6 times your income, and you cannot see a wage rise for a long time, you're in a certain industry where that's unlikely, You may be going to go down to one income because you might have a family. You haven't got any other buffers, etc. Then absolutely you've got to be concerned about the number that you're sort of borrowing about. But every person's situation is different, Harmer. You mean you could have, if you're still working on your career, you could just be, training, right? And your income's going to double, as soon as you finish your study, etc. So it's a really hard number to figure out. There's also, are you buying a starter home or are you buying something to live in long term? Are you going to buy a house that you're going to buy? I had this conversation today, they're looking to buy a house up on the Central Coast, for example. And they're, got a 1-year-old and they're thinking about having another one in a couple of years. And this is their house they're going to really stay in longer term. And they're trying to buy something that's probably renovated because they don't really want to do that. So, if they get it right, they've bought a house in 2021, 2022, they've, made sure they're buying in a good street, blah, blah, blah. But then they haven't got to buy that thing again. So if they stretch a bit today and their incomes do go up over the next 10, 20 years, then maybe that would have been a good decision to stretch a bit harder, right? Especially if they're a house they're going to stay in long term. So a lot of first home buyers don't have that opportunity. It's a shorter runway. And you also got to say, are you stretching for the right reasons? Are you just spending your max because you can? Or you're actually getting value for money by stretching? If you spent an extra 5 or 10%, right? What are you getting for your money? Are you getting a better place that you're going to enjoy living? That's important, but not as important as, is it a better investment? Because there's always a sweet spot in the market, right? Where a lot of buyers enter the market because it's around a certain price point. And that means their maximums are all a similar price point. Because you don't go with a much bigger budget to a much cheaper area. It's just human nature. And so a lot of buyers are out there all sort of with similar budgets. But if you've got a little bit more money than them and they can't stretch or they can't look at those properties, you may get something that's dramatically better for a small portion more. And so, in that situation, Harmon, if you're thinking, well, yeah, maybe I could stretch, but I get a better place to live in, but B, I get a much better investment property, much more land, much better street, much more potential with the property, better privacy, blah, blah, blah. Maybe it's worthwhile stretching. If you sell it one day, property's likely to grow faster and more than where everyone else is trying to afford in the middle market.
Yeah, my view would be there is no rule of thumb that you can apply, right? And it's a bit why the debt to income ratio or even the LVR restrictions that central banks are talking about don't really make a lot of sense, right? Because in some circumstances it is absolutely the right thing to do. In other circumstances it's absolutely the wrong thing to do, right? What you have to do is to go more granular and understand a little bit more about the transaction, about the cash flows, the potential cash flows, and think about what I call the counterfactuals. What happens, for example, if rates rise, or what happens if you lose some income, right? Have you got sufficient flexibility, or have you got other assets or something that you can actually get through that, right? That's the mature conversation that people need to have, right? Which is going right back to our first part of this show, Chris. Those conversations are the really important ones to have, not the one about find me the cheap loan, right? The conversation is precisely what I've just said, which is what are you trying to achieve? Let's have a look at the cash flow. Let's look at some of those counterfactuals. Then you can make a good decision. In some cases, 6, 7, 8, 9 times might be right. But there are also many times when it's completely the wrong thing to do. So I don't think you can pick a set ratio and say it's a good one.
Yeah, absolutely. I think buffers are the key thing. If you're borrowing at, say, 6 times, have you got other buffers? What are your buffers? All those things you were talking about, Martin. Because if you have, then, even if something does happen to your health or work, or then you've got this buffer to get you through that sort of danger zone. It's a lot of conversations I have with a lot of first-home buyers that they've saved really hard. For many years, they've made cutbacks and, they haven't done certain things like their friends have. And they've potentially got a bit of money from family, which always makes things a little bit more stressful because they feel this obligation to get it right. And, just putting that deposit down is quite scary for them because, they go from a big amount in the bank account to a very small amount. And then when they get it settlement, there's a very small amount at the end. And so I really talk around that danger zone to them. They've got to have really good habits after they purchase the property. Don't just rush in and think that things have changed, they've bought a property. No, now you've got to get your buffer back up. And other things we can do to create your buffer, should you potentially pay a little bit of lender's mortgage insurance to create that buffer? And having those conversations up front is really important, because there is that danger zone straight after you purchase a property in that first couple of years, I find, where something happens, there's not much other pools of money to lean on because you put it all into the property. It's quite scary for a lot of first-time buyers.
Right. And the other thing that people often don't do is think about the running costs, right? So when you buy a property, right, what you don't see is that little slot by the front door that says, put your notes in here, right? But actually that's what you have to do, right? You've got rates, and you've got power, and you've got water, and you've got repairs, and, there's an ongoing cost just to keep that place together, right? And people so often just fail to factor that into their thinking.
I think rates and insurance, doing an insurance quote is absolutely a necessity on certain types of property that are higher risk for insurance companies. And you sometimes don't know that, bushfire, flood, lots of different things, right? So doing that's a good idea, just to get a ballpark. Even if you don't end up purchasing the property, you could call up someone like Allianz and figure it out pretty quick. But the repairs, right, the maintaining the asset and fixing things at a sunk cost, absolutely, that's the thing you got to be scared about. And I just, people buying property sight unseen in Victoria in the last few months, Martin, it just defies logic. When you've gone and looked at property before and you've got way overexcited on a Tuesday, Wednesday when the listings come on, and you're like, can't wait for Saturday morning at 11 o'clock, and you've already started placing your furniture in the house, and you get there, and as soon as you even rock up, you're like, what was I thinking? You don't even have to walk through the front door because you see something in the neighbour or something like that, and then you get to the property and you go, this is weird, it's like a labyrinth or something. People are buying these properties sight unseen, and I just don't understand. And I don't understand people buying a property without a building and pest. You've got to do it, even if you don't want to hear what the building and pest is going to say. You've got to do it, and you've got to read it, and you've got to be careful, because that sunk costs and fixing things is a huge risk of buying property, and it's money you're not going to get back, especially if you're forced to sell it. That's the big risk for me.
Yeah, and those due diligence, including things like if you're buying strata, make sure you understand the strata committee ownership structure and all the other obligations that there are there, right? I know a number of people have had really, really rude shocks when they've actually realised what they've brought themselves into.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a couple of horror stories. Even today, a client was saying, I want to get out because of the strata, and we've got other clients selling, not just because of the way they're dealing with issues in the building. They're creating more issues. They're not fixing things. There's politics going on. They're not putting money in the fund. There's things that are urgent, etc. And so absolutely, strata is one of the biggest problems. And sometimes it's hard, even looking at the strata report, a lot of things aren't on the strata report for good reason for the other landlords. So it's not till you move in till you see these things. But if you can, knock on some doors, and you only get one shot at it, remember.
Exactly right. And I always say to people, buying property, it's not like riding a motorbike or riding a cycle. You don't do it enough, right? So you've got to really take your time and make sure that you're doing all of the things, because it's so easy to miss stuff, and it's very, very hard to try and fit it retrospectively, and quite often you can't. So you can actually end up burning a lot of time, effort and money simply because you haven't done the right things in the right order on the way in.
Yeah, it's a catch-22, Martin, to be honest. The thing that will work in this market is really getting an understanding of what's driving that local market, understanding the pricing of certain properties, what different quality of properties are worth. And then and have a very, very targeted brief, right? Be very, very clear and have all the difficult conversations around repayments and, do you really want to do it? Just be very clear on those things. But when you're in the market, if the right property comes on, speed is everything. But that doesn't mean you forget about things. That doesn't mean you not do a contract check. That doesn't mean you don't do a building and pest. These things can happen within the first 24 hours. Yes, you still need to look at the property twice. You don't just go once, get a video and then buy it. Get back for a second viewing, and speed usually does work in this market, because you've got a lot of vendors that are, potentially looking to upgrade, are happy for a price. They're not sure what's going to happen tomorrow. Even the COVID things created so much uncertainty. So speed absolutely is a necessity, not without doing your due diligence.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I keep saying it, and I'll go on saying it because it's so important. I worked some years ago as a building surveyor, so I would go around and look at properties, right? So I know where to look to find the dead bodies, as it were.
Yeah. And every property has got problems.
Yeah.
And some of them are fixable, not that expensive, and some of them can be fixable and actually add value to the property as well. So you can turn a negative into a positive. But some of the things that are unknowns, right? And some of the things that are expensive and structural and have all these other cascading issues. And so, those are the ones, especially some of the ones that are, when we were buying a property in Melbourne a few years ago, and my wife, it wasn't my wife then, we were looking, we fell in love with the property, looked amazing on the photos. We went there. It was a cracking asset. We've been looking for a few months. We got the building and pest report, and it was horrendous. And we were like, wow, this place did not look like it had any issues. And, had the chalk white paint, there was damp issues, problems in the ceiling, the brickwork, it was just tidied up for sale. And we didn't see it. We just couldn't, we were so in love with the property. And the building inspector saying, mate, you're not buying this property. And I'm like, what? We're ready to make an offer. And so, you've just got to sometimes walk away. I mean, we did it with this place we bought here. I mean, there was another property in love, exactly the same situation, looking for a few months, fell in love with it, and got the building pest. Like, mate, that wall's going to fall over at the front. And I still drive past this house. I'm like, is that wall fallen over yet? And is it still bad? And because that would have been, potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars to fix that with zero value add. And so, just be so careful around that. It's a huge problem.
I call that lipsticks on pigs, right?
Yeah.
There's a certain amount of that in the property sector. So, if you see a lot of new paint and bits and pieces, just ask the question. Question as to why is it like that. Now, Jeff asked a little while ago. It's quite an interesting one. We now rank 79th on the Global Innovation Index. It's a misdirection because housing deckers kill so much potential. I think both you, Chris, and I would agree with that, right? We have a very myopic economy, very narrow-based economy. But your point is, yes, that's true. But then, you can't not buy property necessarily just because the economy is stuffed. Yeah,
I mean, you do need to sort of potentially try to, be smart around it. If you are looking to, I think you're right. Like, I mean, the reality is if you've got a big mortgage and kids do this, I know my risk appetite has definitely changed post kids. And a mortgage does that as well, right? So, what people do is they go and they're getting a lot of debt, they have kids and they don't want to start a business and they don't want to take on this risk and they just want to keep paying their property off. And when they've seen the returns they have in property, they've made financial wealth there, even though a lot of it's paper and obviously they haven't sold. But then that gives them comfort and they feel like I don't even want to take a risk because I don't want to risk everything that I've made through this property. And so absolutely, it's a huge problem for our economy.
Yes. Well, I made a submission some time ago on the current government inquiry into housing affordability, right? Supply side only, right? They're not looking at demand side. So I ran my model. I'm just going to show this chart. I think I put this chart up, right? So this is my housing affordability power meter, basically. So what are the most powerful levers that influence housing affordability, right? And guess what? Interest rates and credit availability are the two biggest by a hell of a lot, right?
Yeah.
Then a bit migration, then government incentives, and then lease release and land release and planning, and then lenders mortgage insurance availability, and then tax incentives. But the point is, this is more driven by the debt machine than anything else. It's not actually driven by the lack of supply and all those things, of course. And of course, the federal government's basically wanting to do a hospital pass to the states and blame the states for all the housing affordability issues.
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree. The access to credit and the cost of that credit drives human behaviour, right? And we can get access to a lot of debt, and is quite cheap, right? And so people who, I think from a financial advice point of view, one of the, with property, it's not so much finding a good asset. That's not the biggest the problem. It is just understanding how credit works, understanding the costs, how to use that as a tool for yourself longer term, is one of the most powerful things to understand, especially if you're looking to play in property. And so, like, that's why you need a great mortgage broker. I didn't start this little spiel to push my own drum here, but that's reality. If you can understand credit, how to use it, how that's potentially going to change for you longer term, you can make strategic moves with that credit, right? And that's what people do. And so, if you want to slow down house prices, increase interest rates, and cut the access to credit. Absolutely, those two things will slow down house prices. Is there an incentive for the government to do that? When they're wealth effect, absolutely not. So, I'm not going to hold my breath there. They'll do little things to kind of, potentially win some votes and sound like they're doing something. But, the reality is, do they really care about rising house prices and unaffordability? Absolutely not.
No, and there was another submission by the ex-ANZ chief economist, Saul Eslake, right? And he made the point, think about this in terms of voting numbers, right? There's, many millions of people who own property and are doing quite well because property values are going up, right? And there's 200, 300,000 people who are actually wanting to get into the market, right? And are seeing the ladder being pulled up, make it more difficult, right? But do the math, right? If you're a politician, who are you going to support?
Yeah, I think we spoke about it off air, Martin. I can't remember if it was the start of this before, but a client, a couple of years ago, very anti-property, smart guy, earning great income, just, does not like the system, massive believer in crypto, and, bought a property a couple of years ago. It's done really well. I was chatting to him today and, making lots of money in crypto as well. And he just joked. He said, look, I was a property bear. And then I laugh at myself because I've got this tendency to be a property bull now, right? And I sort of laugh at, buyers do that. They go from, I want to talk the market down so I can buy, and then I buy, then I want to start to confirm my own beliefs, talk it up. The interesting thing there is we are seeing a shift of wealth. It flows back to property. For his example, what are they going to happen with these crypto gains, which are massive, is he wants to buy a beautiful house. What happens when business owners do really well? They want to buy houses, and so, when they do really well in their equity portfolio, we've got some clients at the moment. What are they doing with that? Well, they're doing an expensive build, and it flows back into housing. So a lot of that's happening at the moment as well. Is money around the world is flowing back into housing.
Absolutely. Well, all that liquidity flowing from the central banks, going into stock markets, going into housing, property markets. So buoyant in the US, in the Europe, in the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. Not surprising, right? Just remember this, of course, that in ultimate terms, if you compare the ratios of GDP or ratios of income and things, we're well over where we should be. So there's always a risk that it may not continue, it might come back, right? But we know that the government's going to do everything they can, and they're going to throw the kitchen sink square at it to try and keep property prices going higher.
Absolutely. There's always a risk, right? This is not a risk-free situation, right? But and to think that everything's just going to continue, and think the returns of the last 20 years is going to be the next 20 years is diluted as well, right? We're not going to see that when you talk about the drivers of demand, interest rates dropping isn't going to be one of the big drivers of demand, right? And so you've got to be a bit more fearful, especially buying at current prices than you were 12 months ago or 2 years ago. And so, there is potential the situation we'll see of the fear, which you're talking about these builders in China, etc., where people start getting worried about lending money across the world, and it's just that starts freaking out. What have you got there? And what have I got? And do I want to sell that? And do I want to buy that? And access to credit starts freezing up, and global markets, and we start getting another GFC. Something like that could absolutely happen. You saw Asian crisis, etc. So, is that potentially going to happen in the future? Absolutely. There'll be other crises. And so, does that mean it's going to happen tomorrow? Probably not.
No, and that's of course the point. But the real takeaway from this, there's no such thing as a risk-free investment, whether it's property, whether it's stocks and shares, whether it's crypto, whether it's gold, whatever you do, right? There are risks attached to it, different types of risks. And my own read on the situation at the moment is it's probably the risks and uncertainty in the system, both locally and globally, are probably as high as they've ever been.
Yeah, I think with property though is some of the best returns come with the properties that actually are correlated to the lowest risk. And I know that sounds crazy, but the best returns in properties is driven by scarcity. So the best streets, the best sides of those streets, the most private, they've got the great aspect and sun. So you're going in there and say, well, this is less risk because of all these factors, right? There's only 4 properties have sold in this street in the last 5 years, for example, tightly held, development controls, they're not going to develop in that area. So when you can buy, and because of that scarcity and because of those managing those risks up front, and that's the good thing about property is you can just, a lot of these risks you can think through before you purchase. They don't just all of a sudden pop out and they put a high rise next to you, etc. They will drive its returns long term, because what you've got is something that's scarce. It's likely to continue to get more and more scarce over time, because as they do infill in suburbs, as they build high rise, they build greenfield estates, as people knock down to build townhouses, certain sanctuaries and pockets become less scarce, where they suit those same attributes. And so with property, I actually think you take your risk on the way in. Oh, absolutely, like everything, but you can tick off a few of those risks, and then if you hold those things long term, those are the type of properties that are driven up long term because of scarcity. And so most people don't think about those risks on the way in.
No, that's right. And look, it does beg the question, is property an investment asset, an investment asset class, or is it more about somewhere to live? And I sometimes say to people, those two things might pull in two different directions, right? Because you might want to live in a particular area, in a particular property, because it's where you want to live, right? And it's where you want to put down roots. And it might not be the very best investment you could ever make, but it might be right for you. On the other hand, if you're wanting to do something with a very strong view on financial returns out of the property, you might make a different set of decisions, and they pull in different directions sometimes.
So properties absolutely is a lifestyle asset that that potentially you can make investment gains out of, right? It's so what you want to be doing is buying properties that offer a tangible lifestyle that is scarce, and money will naturally flow into those properties because of the lifestyle benefit attached to those. And there's not enough of those, and there's more and more people, and people don't want to sell those because they already own them, and more people over time want to buy them. And so it's driven by lifestyle, and that's what and that's why the owner-occupier markets, and you can see in the housing markets, are going through the roof. People don't want to rent them because it's hard to rent, and they could get kicked out by the landlords or the rental rules, and they want to own it for security and stability. And there's not enough of them, and so that's what's driving their prices. And so absolutely it's a lifestyle asset, but there's obviously investment returns to be had, especially when you overlay things like CGT free and blah blah blah, right? And so and that's where people get it wrong. They start saying, well, it's an investment, I'll go buy this sort of hot spot, and then I'll get this positive cash flow, and I'll throw a granny flat out the back, and I'll do this. A lot of those things, you come in with the wrong mindset. You're thinking about the numbers. What you should be thinking about is, what is a lifestyle attached to this property? Who really wants it? Are there any more of them? Can they build more of them? Is it who's really going to want that property in 5-10 years time? What are they earning? What other money have they got? Like, these are the things that drive property prices up longer term. Not so much if you can potentially get a slightly better yield and put a bit more create a bit more yield by renting rooms out and all these other nonsense I've heard over the years.
No, absolutely. And there are people on YouTube who say, I've got the magic secret here. I've owned 6 properties in the last 6 years. I can do it on $60,000 or whatever it is, right? Just be really cautious with those, because there's a whole lot of stuff they're not telling you.
Yeah, a lot of, and I think this is quite prolific out there right now, Martin, where you look at their returns. And you cut up their portfolio. Usually there's 1 or 2 good properties, and then the ones they usually purchased a long time ago. It's usually their house, or maybe one house they bought somewhere near their other house. And then they've gone and bought all these, regional, cheap and cheerful properties, so they can have this quantity strategy. They can tell their mates at the barbecue, I've got 7 properties. And those potentially they've gone up, right? But once you take in stamp duty, selling costs, capital gains tax, the potential risk withholding costs, which you don't know, and all that sort of stuff, it's not that much money they're making, right? And those properties, if anything, have had a massive tailwind, right, with low rates. And so I don't think, they're getting inflated right now because of all that tailwind. Things can unwind for them pretty quickly. And so, it's interesting talking about that scenario.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, a couple of those have actually been paying to advertise on my channel. So, often you'll get their adverts before you actually watch my show. So, just take it, just be careful though, folks. Now, here's one from Jason from earlier on. Jason, thanks very much for the super chat. During COVID, and a lot of properties changing hands through video, i.e. actually never physically inspecting, especially relocations interstate. Any idea what percentage of property sales that represents? I've got some data, but I don't know whether you have any data on that as well, Chris?
Not really. I still wouldn't do it. I mean, we've got a few clients that are trying to buy regionally at the moment. They've actually been to these locations and, they've just said, my friend or my, family member has sort of said it's a great spot and, it looks affordable. And I've looked online, I've gone to Street View, etc. I still wouldn't do it. I just say the video gives you that charm, that sort of wow factor, the real appeal. The video doesn't go and look at the neighbour and look over the back fence and, see the mechanic just up the road and, maybe there's some less desirable properties here and, you can't really hear the noise and, maybe there's some privacy you can see through that window. So it's not the same. A video does not give you the sensory experience as going to the property. You can't smell on a video, for example, and smell is a big part of a property, right? Mosquitoes. You don't see the mosquitoes in a video, do you? And I could keep going here. So, I'm not comfortable buying a property on video. I don't think you should either. I think you should just get out and actually make it happen. I think it's a...
So I did a little bit of work on this for a client looking at some Queensland postcodes, right? And there were quite a few that were being bought interstate, particularly from Melbourne, because people were locked down in Melbourne. They were looking at Queensland thinking, Queensland's going to be a nice place to go, right? And in some postcodes, it's 5 or 6% of transactions were actually sight unseen.
Yeah, and I think this is one of my biggest worries, I guess, with a lot of the spruikers, and I'm happy to call them that, the people buying cheap and cheerful properties in the outskirts of capital cities. And they come and they do their little plan. They say you can buy 3 in 3 years and you use the equity in one and it'll go up and blah, blah, blah. Why are they buying in these areas? The reason is it's easier to buy. If you were running a business, the best buyers agents I know, I was bumped into one this morning, it's so hard to be a great buyer's agent because it's actually hard to find great property. It's tough going. You've got to be knocking on doors. You're going to compete with other desperate buyers, etc. So these buyer's agents that goes to these investment markets is they know they can buy easy. Buy under market value. Well, that means you got a good deal. Why did you get a good deal? Why would you sell a property under market value? You got it for market value. You just got it because there was no demand and the vendor was desperate. That is a warning sign of not buying that property. And so I'll leave that rant there, but hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah. So I think you can take it that we're not very impressed with the idea of buying property sight unseen. And I think your point actually about you can't smell it is very good because you can smell damp in the basement, right? For example. And also check what's in the immediate area. I remember doing some work in the UK around a particular property, right? And I went to this little village to look at this property. And there was this weird waft in the air, and I couldn't work out what it was, and discovered that just down the road there was actually an abattoir. And next to the abattoir there was a glue factory, right? And this glue factory was chucking out these fumes through working hours for the whole week, right? Now, you'd never pick that up on a Street View, would you?
Oh, absolutely. I've got plenty of stories like that, Martin. It just... even the noise. Noise is a big one, right? Like properties are affected by noise a lot. And, unless you're on could be even a school, right? It's not say you shouldn't buy next to a school, but, like a video, if it's not at school time, right? And the kids are in the class, it sounds like, this is peaceful. But if you haven't done the Street View and sussed it out, people, agents will turn all the lights on. A client buying sent me a video the other day. I'm like, it looks a bit small and, if it's looking small in a video, like in person, it probably feels a lot smaller. Like spaces just feel different. It's like trying to buy a photo just looking at pictures. They're going to show the best bits. And so,
yes. And even the lens on the camera makes a difference in terms of the spaciousness of the particular location, right? So, you've got to be a little bit careful, Well, we're coming close towards the end, but there was a couple of areas that in your notes that you put together very kindly for this, you talked about areas that you're concerned about. I'd like to go through some of those a little bit because I think they're really interesting. And the first thing that you said there was good areas, but buyers are paying huge prices for poor assets. Can we unpack that a bit more?
So it's pretty obvious when the market was going absolutely nuts in March, April at the start of this year, FOMO was out of control and there was a lot of desperate bidders out there and people were paying way ahead of the market. And that's why we saw huge growth in the median price in that time. And a lot of those people, those prices haven't been replicated yet. We've got multiple examples, etc. And they paid big prices for poor property. We've really seen buyers get a much pickier, and it makes sense. As you're going to pay more, you start to question and go, do I really want this mortgage for that? And so that question's starting to hit home. But I am worried because you are still seeing the poorer properties. A lot of people don't understand what the difference between a poor property and a good property is, but you've got to really think about what's comparing two different properties in a suburb. You can very easily see, well, that one's say more private and quiet, and that one's quite noisy like a busy road. That one's got a north-facing backyard, not the front door, which real estates love to advertise, because you want the sun to hit the back of the property, not the front of the property where you spend most of your time. And so in a suburb, you've got poorer properties and better properties because of the lifestyle attached to that property. And my worry is the busier roads, the darker, things with privacy issues, the weird layouts, lots of problems with maybe it's a bad block, etc. People paying very big prices for that just to get into the market, especially at the lower end of a sort of suburb. Just to get in, they're paying these big prices. And so that gap between the good stuff and the poor stuff's getting really squeezed because people are just desperate to get in. So I'm absolutely worried about that. I think when you go and sell that in 10, 15 years' time, their returns will be much, much lower because they paid such a big price on the entry. And you also lose control. The biggest problem with buying a poor asset is you lose control of the sale. Because if you want to sell it in times when times are tough, you don't get any. None of your buyers want your property. They all want the nicer stuff because times are tough. So there's other people selling and they've got good stuff. So I'll buy that and I'll be patient. I'm not desperate. I'm not. It's a buyer's market. And so if you have to sell at that point in time, which you never know, death, divorce, lots of other reasons, you can get really smashed. And they're the properties that got smashed in 2018 in that downturn. Is the things that are compromised. And so they end up having to hold on because they don't want to crystallize this loss. And they sell it 10, 15 years later, and that gets much bigger between the good and the poor. So, I'm really worried, obviously, around that because I think it's quite prevalent. But I know from what we're seeing, clients have really cooled their jets, and they're being much more selective. And, hence why you're still seeing a lot of listings sitting on the market. It just shows that poor listings can't sell in hot markets. And you should be the last one buying those right now.
Yeah, so I was going to say exactly that. There are still a lot of properties there that were there a long time ago and haven't moved, right? There's a small proportion of new ones coming on and moving quite quickly. So one of the things I say to people is it's worth understanding how long that property has been on and off the market, right?
It's one of the first things you can do, Martin. Just do an RP data report. Bang, it's been on the market for 180 days.
Yep.
Now, that's not always... It's definitely a good warning sign, but that doesn't mean it's always like, oh, don't even look at it. It could easily have been overpriced. And it could easily have been styled poorly, or it could be the street or something about it's really turning people off. But actually, fundamentally it could be something that could be changed, maybe not the street, but so to say, but it's usually definitely a warning sign. I mean, I get clients, and you're writing on the door, you're the worst buyer. The agent's desperate, right? And then you walk in, you have no idea how long this property's been on the market. And then they're telling you, it's going to sell next week at auction and blah, blah, blah. And they get a bit, and they say, you better make an offer now. And all of a sudden, and so one of the first things clients do when they send me a property link is I do an RP data, and I do look at that. How long has it been on the market? What's happened the last times it tried to sell? Did it sell fast? I think that's always a good thing. How many agents has it gone through? Sometimes calling those agents. Like if you're trying to buy a property, right, and it's from X agent, the person selling that probably got 3 agents through. We always like getting 3 quotes, right? We got 3 quotes from 3 different agents. They probably got the person who bought the property off to come through again, or maybe they didn't, and then that agent's pissed off basically because they didn't get to resell the property, right? And they feel like they've got a connection to when you buy a property of someone. You feel like you've got a connection to sell it through the person you purchased off, even though there's no, obligation there. So if that agent has sold the property, but they're not getting a chance to resell that property, they are feeling burnt. And every agent's got an ego. If you call that agent and say, hey, that property on Smith Street 14, I know you sold it 6 years ago, but you're not selling it now. What do you think of it? A lot of them will give you all the negatives of that property and why it was hard to sell and why they're glad they're not selling it. And all those are really interesting insights because they're things that, yes, they might be overinflating those, but they're interesting insights that you're trying to buy a property because they're things you might not have thought about because the other agent's telling you all the good things. And so, probably rambling a lot, Martin, but it is 9:30 at night and I've got an 18-month-old that keeps you up some nights.
No, you're doing very well. We're very close to the end. But just in terms of the other areas, you said high-rise hells was your second one, right? We sort of touched on that, but just to reiterate, there's still a lot of pain in high-rise land, isn't there?
Absolutely, and this is definitely something I'm seeing. The self-justification is that when the market's tough, people's persistence and patience definitely starts to wane and they look to get an easy result. And so developers are absolutely licking their lips. Higher prices creates more desire for off the plan. And so I do think you're going to start to see more building, right, and more pre-sales for apartments. We can already see clients tempted to do that, but also clients are finding it really tough to get let's say, talk about apartments because that's what we're talking about. They find it really hard to get the good stuff, the scarce stuff, because it's not on the market and it's going hot. And they're sort of like, oh, look, I just really need to buy and I really like the area and, I'm renting in the area because a lot of people rent in these areas and they're just buying into them and they're sort of justifying that it's better than not buying at all. And so, and a lot of investors are trying to bail. As soon as prices rise, then you get a lot more stock on the market. And so, absolutely, I think you've got a problem with new buildings that are better built. I do think, people are wanting a different type of property than the stock that's been built for 30 years. And I do think buildings are going to naturally have to improve to sell. I'll cross my fingers on that one. I do think I'm worried about people basically buying in these investor stock, really.
Absolutely. And then you also made the point about the house and land packages, which we've touched on in previous shows, right? Be really, really careful with those regional home and land packages. They're just all over the place.
The regional ones are definitely the worry. People moving to regional areas and then going, I can't afford the nice areas. So I'll buy in the fringes. The problem is the fringes are the fringe. And over the side of that, usually motorway, is bucket loads of farms that absolutely, if there's 10,000 more people wanting to move to Geelong, for example, there's 5,000 houses that could easily be built. And so that doesn't mean that the Geelong, and if your property is just of the same, yes, it maybe has a bit more land. And you go, oh yeah, but I've got 600 squares and that's only 350. Well, all those buyers that would have bought your property will want that new property up the road because they're offering them everything for free, the free kitchen, the blah, 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 all these incentives. And so I'm really worried about the regional, people getting burnt on these regional shifts and then not being able to go back to the capital city or burning everything they've saved. And then the affordability part of the market, absolutely, it just has these same sort of drivers, As soon as there's more demand, they'll start building. You can already see this. I follow developer websites and look at the big sort of transactions on the land sales, etc. And I'm always interested when Stockland buys a site for 100 million. Where is it? Oh, far out. It's 50 k's north of Melbourne. 50 k's, and so that what's happened to the last? And there's no properties for between 30 and 50 k's. So what's all that land? Where's all that been sold? It's already been sold. It's it's already been land banked to be released for developments. And so you've got to be careful in the house and land.
Yeah, well, Chris, I really appreciate all your advice tonight, and people have really been lapping it up. So well done. Now, if they want to find out more about you, where do they go?
Wealthful.com.au. It's a bit of a mouthful. That's what I was thinking when I came up with the name. WEALTHFUL.com.au. Book a call on there. Like, the first step is to have a strategy call. We just get to know your situation. Where are you at? What are you thinking about doing? What can you do better? Let's figure that out. Then we can figure out the rest out. So more than happy to help any of your listeners. And over the years, that's why I keep coming on here, Martin. Is lots of people have come off the DFA community who are just trying to get a different take on it. And that's why they're listening to you, Martin. They're going, okay, well, I do want to enter, but I want to do it wise, and so they reach out over time.
Absolutely. And you also, of course, do the Elephant in the Room podcast with your colleague.
Yep. Martin, to be honest, you're always our best guest. In fairness, your views go through the roof. You've got some sort of a fan base here. So a pat on the back. Maybe it's Cookie Boy, and he seems to love you a lot.
Well, I've got a few people who seem to get some value, which is great. And Veronica's on in a couple of weeks' time, by the way, folks, so we'll be able to get some more from her too. But I want to say thank you, Chris, for your time. Best of luck over the next 3 weeks. I'm sure your life is about to take another interesting, change of direction as things happen. But I'm sure you'll be back on the show down the track again. And I hope everything goes well.
Thank you so much, Martin. And thanks for tonight. Have a good sleep.
Okay. See you later. Bye-bye.
See you, mate. Bye.
So there you go. Great insights from Chris, as always. And want to say thanks to him, and thank you all for watching. Just before I close the show, I want to tell you that next week we're switching over and talking about investing. I've got Tony LaCantra coming back on, and remember Tony was taking basically a bet on the markets falling some months ago, so it'll be interesting to see whether he thinks that's going to happen or not. And you'll be able to chance to interact with him and get some insights on some of those micro stocks and some of the other stuff that he covers. So that's same time next week. I look forward to seeing you on the show then. And I want to say thank you very much for spending some of your evening with me. Take care. Keep safe, and we'll do it all again next week. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. Cheerio.